Working with a Grandmaster by Michael Stean.
This tape is intended to help you with analysis in real game situations. The way I intend to do this is to go through two games which I played recently in Yugoslavia, that is, recent to the making of this recording. My reason for choosing recent games is that I can still recall my thoughts, calculations and assessments made during these games, and so you can compare your calculations directly with mine. Moreover, with the benefit of hindsight, I can pinpoint my mistakes and miscalculations. Nobody is perfect, least of all grandmasters, but very few will ever admit to even the slightest blemish in one of their masterpieces. Well, these games will not be masterpieces, but real practical games with real practical analysis. Now what I shall do is this. I will go through the games, move by move, indicating points at which you should stop and analyze yourself. When I say analyze, I mean really analyze. Remember, I used up most of my allotted 2.5 hours for each of these games, not to mention the time I spent thinking during my opponent's time. So to get the most out of this cassette, you should spend a similar amount of time with the machine switched off, analyzing yourself. I recommend that you use 2 chess sets, if possible. One to record the current game position at all times, the other for analysis. This will help to avoid your getting lost, because at various points I shall give variations starting from game positions which did not occur in the game, and then retrace my steps to recover the game position and continue. Well, that concludes my preamble, so now let's get down to business. The first of my games was against the Canadian international master Leon Piasecki. I, that is you, have the white pieces, and I shall go through the opening moves with you. White pawn to king 4, black pawn to queen's bishop 4, white knight to king's bishop 3, black pawn to king 3, white pawn to queen 4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, black pawn to queen's rook 3. And now a slightly unusual variation, white bishop to king 2, but quickly transposing into a well-known position. Black knight to king's bishop 3, white knight to queen's bishop 3, black pawn to queen 3, white pawn to king's bishop 4, black's reply, queen to bishop 2, white castles, black knight to queen's bishop 3, white bishop to king 3, black bishop to queen 2. Okay, this is the first position in which you can do some thinking. What is your next move with white? In these positions, there is no clearly best move, so it's very much a matter of taste. But the 3 moves I would expect you to consider are the move I played, which you can play on your game set, white king to rook 1. But perfectly good alternatives would be queen to king 1, or maybe best of all, pawn to queen's rook 4, which would stop black expanding on the queen side as he now does. Because in the game, after white king to rook 1, black plays pawn to queen's knight 4. White replies pawn to queen's rook 3. And now black develops bishop to king 2. Now again, switch off and think about your next move. White plays queen to king 1, which is really the only good logical move in the position. The alternative bishop to bishop 3 is possible, but is rather committal, and queen to king 1 is clearly best in this position. Black replied rook to queen's bishop 1, which I remember regarding as a rather suspicious move, because I know well that in these Scheveningen positions in the Sicilian, the rook on the queen's bishop file is often superfluous, and black would do better to castle. So now you can think about your next move with white. The move I played was queen to knight 3, which is very normal in these positions. But retrospectively, I can say it would have been better, or should I say, it would have made it more difficult for black if I had played the waiting move rook to queen 1, because then black would not have the chance to carry out the interesting idea which he produced in the game, which was that in this position, after queen to knight 3, I naturally expected him to castle. But I got a rather surprise when the move pawn to king's rook 4 was played by black. Now I expect you'll want to have a nice long think about this, so switch off and can try and work out what is happening. Now first of all, you should notice that if you take the knight's pawn, queen takes knight's pawn, then it is a draw, because black plays rook to king's knight 1, white queen to rook 6, rook to knight 3, queen to rook 8 check, rook back to knight 1 again, and perpetual attack on the queen. So, assuming that you are an ambitious player, and you should be, you should reject queen takes knight's pawn and look for something else. The move I played was queen's rook to king 1, which I believed at the time, and which I still do believe to be the best move in the position. With the possibility of the position opening up, it's very important to bring your last piece into play. So you must play a move with the queen's rook. Now, the rook may seem to be better on queen 1, queen's rook to queen 1, but in fact, the crucial squares in this position lie on the king's file, and eventually you want to, white's natural attacking thrust would be pawn to king 5, and the rook on king 1 will give this veiled support. So, white has played queen's rook to king 1. And now black replies pawn to king's rook 5. Now, when you were thinking about your last move for white, you should have considered what your reaction to the move pawn to rook 5 would be. If you didn't, you should do so now, and you should consider the position for a long time, because it's very complicated. In particular, you of course have to consider whether or not you can take the king's knight's pawn, and you should calculate very accurately. So, in this position, I thought for about 25 minutes, and I didn't see everything that was happening, so you should probably think for longer if you expect to see everything. Okay, well let's see what you found. The move I played was to take the pawn. Queen takes knight's pawn. Now, in order to take this pawn, you must calculate 3 variations. The first variation goes as follows. Rook to knight 1, queen to rook 6, black rook to knight 3, queen takes pawn, and now discovered moves with the knight will not work because white has a check on king's rook 8. So, go back. The second possibility is black can attack the queen with rook to rook 2. Queen to knight 5. And now again you notice that discovered moves with the knight, for example knight takes king's pawn, will fail because white has a check on knight 8 this time. But there is a third possibility, which was played in the game, and which it is very important for you to have seen. After white queen takes knight's pawn, black replied rook to rook 2. The white queen must retreat to knight 5. And now the move king to bishop 1. If you did not see this move earlier, you should reanalyze the position now and work out what's going on. If you did see the move earlier, you should have prepared a reply for white, because the position is potentially dangerous for him, his queen being completely incarcerated. So, switch off and analyze. The move played is white pawn to king 5. And ideally, you should have prepared this move before taking the knight's pawn. Now this position is very complicated indeed. So much so that I still don't know what's going on in the position. So you should make a careful note of the position and analyze it very, very carefully indeed. When I played the game, I remember thinking that I was winning in this position with white. And in fact, when I took the knight's pawn, I felt I was winning because I had the move pawn to king 5 in this position. But it's not clear at all. And I overlooked the move which black actually played in the game in reply to pawn to king 5. So have a long, long think. Okay, let's check your calculations. The first variation will run as follows. Black pawn takes pawn. You should suspect this move is bad because it opens lines for the white rooks and bishops onto the black king. And in fact it is bad. White replies pawn takes pawn. And now two possibilities. Firstly, queen takes pawn. White knight takes knight. Now black is forced to exchange queens. Queen takes queen. Bishop takes queen. Now black recaptures. Bishop takes knight. Now he is hanging a piece on bishop 6. White plays bishop takes knight. And the final point is that after black pawn to rook 6, you exchange bishops. Bishop takes bishop check, king takes bishop, and interpose bishop to bishop 3 on the long diagonal, and your piece up for nothing. So that's the first variation. The second variation, after the moves pawn to king 5, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, is to take the king pawn with the knight. But now the black knight on bishop 6 is hanging. White plays rook takes knight, and he's guaranteed to win 2 pieces for a rook. And you can also notice that after pawn to king 5, pawn takes pawn, in this position, black also has no good knight move, because if the knight runs away anywhere, for example to king 5, white has the very strong move queen to knight 6, which attacks everything. So it's clear after pawn to king 5 that black must not exchange pawns and open the position. You could almost predict this without calculation, but these things have to be calculated. Now, the second possibility after pawn to king 5, and the move which I expected, is knight to king 5 by black. Now, if you hadn't seen or underestimated this possibility, you should reanalyze. But if you had seen it coming, as I had, then white can play a very strong queen sacrifice. Knight takes knight. That is the knight that's just moved to king 5. Black bishop takes queen. And now white pawn takes pawn. If you hadn't seen the possibility of the queen sacrifice, then have a look at the position now. Black has to move his queen, and there are basically not many possibilities for him. He can't put the queen on knight 3 or rook 2 because it's on the same diagonal as the bishop and he will lose it to a discovered check. If he puts the queen on knight 2, then the move knight to queen's bishop 5 will be very strong, because after the queen runs away to rook 2, he still loses the queen to knight takes knight, bishop takes knight, knight takes king's pawn check, discovering an attack on the queen. So after pawn takes pawn attacking the queen must retreat either to queen's knight 1 or to queen 1, and then white plays pawn takes bishop. And if you look at the position, you will see white has two pieces, a collection of very strong pawns, and a very strong attack for the queen. And I reckon this position is winning for white. However, if you go back to the position on your master set again, which is the position after white has played pawn to king 5, you should look for another move for black. And this is a move which I completely underestimated, and I did not expect it at all. But black played the very strong move knight to king's knight 1. This is in the position after white has played pawn to king 5, and we are back in the game now. Black knight to king's knight 1, and the white queen is forced to retreat to knight 4. Because if you try to interpose the move pawn takes pawn, then black replies queen takes pawn with a double attack on the knight on queen 4 and on the queen, and that's very embarrassing for white. So the white queen has retreated to knight 4, and black plays pawn takes pawn. White, of course, replies pawn takes pawn, and black captures the king pawn with the queen. He cannot capture with the knight, because white could capture on king 6, knight takes pawn check. There's a pin on the king's bishop file. So black has played queen takes pawn. Now this is another very critical position. Both queens are very exposed, and both kings are becoming very exposed. And you should think very, very carefully about the position. So switch off and have a nice long think. Right, firstly, if you think the move white bishop to queen 3 looks good, you are wrong, because black replies rook to knight 2, and the point being that the white queen cannot defend the white knight on queen 4, except by going to bishop 4, and an exchange of queens will inevitably be good for black. And the other point is that the discovery bishop to rook 6, attacking the black queen and pinning the black rook, always loses to knight takes bishop, which attacks the white queen. And this theme occurs in many, many variations, and this is one of the basic strengths of the move knight to knight 1 by black, that this discovered attack, bishop to rook 6, is never strong with the white queen on knight 4. So bishop to queen 3 is not good. The second possibility is to play knight takes knight, but this must be bad. One of the themes of this position is that black wants white to exchange knights with knight takes knight, thereby enabling him to recapture the bishop and bring his bishop into play. Conversely, white wants black to capture knight takes knight, so that white can recapture the bishop and bring his bishop into play. And the tempo won or lost by this capture can prove decisive. So if you have to play the move knight takes knight, then you're in trouble, because black will reply bishop takes knight, and now suddenly there'll be a terrifying attack discovered on the white square king's knight 2. He's threatening rook to knight 2 or pawn to rook 6 and all kinds of things, and white will get mated. So the correct move, and the only good move, is white bishop to bishop 3. And now, for a change, you should find black's move. Switch off and calculate, and try and find what black should play in this position. Well, the first possibility is to try kicking the white queen. So he can try knight to bishop 3. But the white queen retreats to rook 3, where it's nice and snug. And black is now in trouble, because if he tries to capture the knight on queen 4, knight takes knight, there comes bishop to rook 6 check. And this discovered attack is now possible, because black does not have the reply knight takes bishop attacking the queen, so black's lost his queen. The second possibility for black is to play knight takes knight, but as I pointed out, he doesn't want to do that. He's just going to be left with a terrible position. White replies bishop takes knight, and black's in full-scale retreat. The third possibility is the move he played, rook to knight 2. But we'll leave that for a bit, because black has another move which is stronger, much stronger. Have you seen it? It's not obvious, or not immediately obvious, but black's best move in this position is pawn to rook 6, a move which at the time of the game I had completely underestimated. And I won't try and analyse all the ramifications after pawn to rook 6 on this tape, because it would go on forever and we would never reach either a conclusion or an end. I analysed this move with my opponent in the post-mortem for a long time, and we never came to a positive decision about the position. But the move pawn to rook 6 must be played for the following reasons. Firstly, it opens the long white diagonal for black's counterattack. Secondly, and more importantly, it takes away the square king's rook 3 from white's queen. One of the most important features of the position is that white's queen is on a very exposed square, and if it finds a nice, safe, cosy retreat, then it's black's king being stuck in the centre that will become relevant. So black must somehow open lines against the white king and take away a good square for the white queen, and this move does both. However, black didn't play this move, as I said. He played the move rook to knight 2. And now it looks a strong move, because if white moves the queen away, then black replies knight takes knight. So what do? The answer, of course, is that you play first with white knight takes knight. So that if black rook takes queen, white knight takes queen, and white has a piece more. Of course, you must calculate black queen desperados carefully in this position. For example, his queen can desperado itself for the knight on queen's bishop 3 or for the bishop on king 3. But if you calculate these lines, you'll find black always comes out with less material, indeed considerably less material. So he must recapture bishop takes knight. This is the move played, bishop takes knight. And now, of course, the queen can retreat very safely, queen to rook 3. Now, question, how would you assess this position? Well, I assess this position as probably winning for white. And in fact, at the time of the game, I felt this was the logical conclusion of white's play. Because remember, when I first went in for taking the queen to knight's pawn, I said I thought I was winning. And I saw no reason to fault any of my moves up to this point. Admittedly, I'd overlooked the move knight to knight 1, but I thought, well, it can't be any good, it goes backwards. And I felt that this was the logical conclusion of white's play. His position started off better, it should still be better, and that's how chess works. But in fact, of course, I was wrong, because I'd overlooked the move pawn to rook 6 earlier. But now I was right. White is much better in this position, and white ought to win it. And the reason is that black's counterattack has dried up completely. There are no counter threats against the white position, and black's pieces are getting very exposed on the central files. His queen's on an exposed square, his king's stuck in the centre. However, with white you must be very careful to avoid endgames, because in the endgame, the black king in the centre and the two central pawns and the rook on the queen's bishop file all combine to make endgames very, very good for black. Okay, black now played the move bishop takes bishop. And this is a move you should be very pleased to see, because control of this long white diagonal is a very important factor in the position. White recaptures queen takes bishop, and now the queen is pointing in two directions. It's attacking on the king's bishop file, and it's also threatening to penetrate on knight 7. Also, he is threatening, that is, white is threatening, bishop to rook 6, which wins the exchange, because the reply knight takes bishop no longer attacks the queen. So in this position, black panicked and played pawn to rook 6. It looks desperate, but think carefully. Now the move I played was simply queen takes pawn. But did you see the possibility instead of playing bishop to rook 6? If you thought this was clearly refuted by pawn takes pawn check, you're wrong, because white plays queen takes pawn. And now the white queen cannot be captured because of the pin. So if you calculate further, you'll see black must play knight takes bishop, white plays rook takes queen, black plays rook takes queen, and white recaptures king takes rook. So why not play this for white? White has won the exchange. Because, as I said earlier, the endgames are very promising for black. And even with the exchange less, black can put up a tremendous fight in this position. He plays knight to bishop 4, and now he has threats of bishop to bishop 3, or maybe bishop takes rook's pawn, and the two central pawns are very strong, and it's very difficult for white to win this position. And since I assess the position as being a winning one for white, I don't want to be confronted with technical difficulties in a position where I have an easy attack and can just take a pawn. So let's go back to the position where black has just played pawn to rook 6, and white plays queen takes pawn. I wondered at this point whether I had overlooked something terrible, or whether pawn to rook 6 was sheer desperation. And it turned out that it was sheer desperation, because my opponent played queen to queen 3 in this position to get his queen out of the attack on the king file. The point of his pawn to rook 6 had merely been to deflect my queen off the dangerous long white diagonal. So now it's your move with white, and you're a pawn up, and you have a raging attack. But how do you continue it? Always try and find the best move. What's the most incisive move for white here? The move is bishop to rook 6. Clearly black must take it. Knight takes bishop. And now rook takes king's pawn. Now white has won the second pawn because he's clearly winning the knight. So black queen to queen 7, and white rook takes knight. Black soldiered on here. Rook to bishop 5. And now I'll give you white's next move for free. Rook to knight 8 check. And black's next move comes for nothing as well. Rook to knight 1. So how do you finish him off? Be careful, don't be too impetuous. It would seem that the combination rook takes pawn check, king takes rook, queen to rook 7 check would do very nicely. But be careful. Black plays king to bishop 3. And now if you spend time to take your rook back, your mate on the back rank, and if you don't, then it's not so clear. So instead of rook takes pawn check, instead of trying to be flash, you can just play the simple, as I did, rook takes rook check, king takes rook, queen to bishop 5. And now black can't defend his king's bishop pawn. He can only play pawn to bishop 3. And then you ram all your pieces down his throat with knight to queen 5, or queen to knight 6 check, or queen to king 6 check. Anyway, we shall never know, because after queen to bishop 5, black resigns. Your first game was a nice tactical Sicilian, but for the second one, it's going to be a nice positional Catalan. Again, you, that is I, have the white pieces, and your opponent is the Yugoslav Grandmaster Rajcevic. And the game starts as follows. White, pawn to queen's bishop 4, black, pawn to king 3. White, pawn to king's knight 3, black pawn to queen 4. White bishop to knight 2, black knight to king's bishop 3, white pawn to queen 4, black pawn to queen's bishop 4, and now with the choice of pawn captures, white bishop's pawn takes pawn. Black knight takes pawn, white knight to king's bishop 3, black knight to queen's bishop 3, white castles, black bishop to king 2, and now white plays pawn takes pawn, and black recaptures bishop takes pawn. So this is your starting position. It's a common sort of Catalan position. Have a think about forming a plan and how you would continue. The move I chose was pawn to queen's rook 3. The mechanics of this position are as follows. The black knight on queen 4 effectively stops white developing normally with knight to queen's bishop 3, because black would swap knights and white's queenside pawns are split. On the other hand, white doesn't want to chase the black knight away with pawn to king 4, because a pawn on king 4 would block the white fianchettoed bishop and also leave weak squares on the queen file. So white has to find an alternative way to develop, and in particular he wants to leave his queen's knight at home for a while, because it cannot develop on its normal square bishop 3. So he prepares to expand on the queen side with pawn to queen's knight 4 and fianchetto the queen's bishop before doing anything. Alternative plan would have been to play queen to bishop 2 and then rook to queen 1, bringing the major pieces into the center and still waiting with the minor pieces, because you don't want yet to develop the knight on bishop 3. However, the one disadvantage of playing queen to bishop 2 is that black would reply queen to king 2. And now it's important to notice that black queen has a nice, safe, stable square on king 2, whereas the white queen is later going to be kicked away, because black's going to play in some moment bishop to queen 2 and rook to queen's bishop 1. And then, with veiled threats on the QB file, white's going to have to move his queen away to a more stable square. And it's very important in these semi-open positions to get your queen onto a stable square, because on the open files in the center, it's always going to run into trouble sooner or later. And it's very important to find a good square for your queen. So bear that in mind as the game progresses. Anyway, we're not playing queen to bishop 2, we're playing pawn to queen's rook 3. Black replies castles. White plays pawn to queen's knight 4. Of course, you check that that black cannot exploit the temporary weakness on the long diagonal. If he plays queen to bishop 3, you just play rook to rook 2. And the queen will be driven away. But he doesn't play queen to bishop 3. He retreats the bishop to king 2, which is the best move, because after white bishop to queen's knight 2, he opposes bishops on the long diagonal with bishop to bishop 3. And now this is your first big decision of the game. What do you do about these opposing bishops? Have a think about it and form a plan, or decide how you're going to develop your position. Well, first of all, if you hand this long diagonal over to black by playing bishop takes bishop and black recapturing queen takes bishop, then white has nothing. You must play rook to rook 2, and the black knight on queen 4 starts to look very strong, because white can never develop his queen's knight. As soon as he develops his queen's knight, knight to bishop 6 would come and hit him. So you mustn't concede the long black diagonal. So you have to defend the bishop with your queen. And there are 4 possible squares from which to do this. Bishop 2, bishop 1, queen 2, or knight 3. Now, which one did you decide? If you didn't decide, choose now. The move I played was queen to knight 3. I felt it was the best move because it is the knight 3 is the one square where the white queen can feel safe from attacks by black rooks. It's a good stable square, and white is preparing to develop with queen's knight to queen 2 and put his rooks in the center. But you have to calculate very carefully your reply to the move which black played to black's reply, which was pawn to queen's rook 4. This was the move played, pawn to queen's rook 4. And you should have seen this move when you played queen to knight 3, and you should have had a reply ready. If not, you must think about it now. The only move for white in this position is pawn to king 4. And let me explain why. If you don't play pawn to king 4, but play the natural move pawn to knight 5 instead, black plays pawn to rook 5, attacking the queen, which must now run away to either qb2 or queen's rook 2. It doesn't matter where, because black will next move his knight into rook 4, the square vacated by the advancing pawn, and then he'll have an excellent position with knights on queen 4 and rook 4, and he's threatening to come into knight 6. And white's advance on the queen side has proved disastrous. So you mustn't let that happen. So going back, you have to do something about the situation, and the only move is pawn to king 4, which dislodges the black knight, and which threatens, if the knight moves away, to drive black further back with pawn to king 5. So black replied, in answer to pawn to king 4, bishop takes bishop. Now, of course, it's easy to check that if you start taking pieces, pawn takes knight, he plays bishop takes rook, pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn, and black comes out with the exchange more. So you must recapture queen takes bishop. And now it's black's turn again. Okay, you're in the black driving seat now. What do you play? Well, the correct move here is simply to retreat the knight to knight 3, and after pawn to knight 5, not knight to bishop 5 or knight to rook 5, when the white queen will move attacking the knight, and black will have two knights at emprise, but again the simple retreat knight to rook 2. And this position I noticed to be quite okay for black. Despite the fact that the knights seem to be a bit out of play, the white queen side's a little bit extended, and he's left with this silly looking pawn on king 4, which blocks his bishop. And this position is equal, and this is how black should have played. And the fact that black can do this indicates that maybe my move queen to knight 3 was not correct. However, if you go back to the position after the bishops have been swapped, with the black knight on queen 4 attacked by the pawn on king 4, he erroneously chose the move queen to bishop 3. And now what do you play against this? Well, it's tempting to play pawn to king 5, but then black will move his queen away, queen to bishop 4. You kick the knight, pawn to knight 5, and the knight retreats to king 2. And black is okay here. He has a nice strong knight on queen 4, and your position is a little overextended. The position is about equal, I think. But you can do better. After queen to bishop 3, you swap queens. Queen takes queen, black recaptures, knight takes queen. And now advance on the queen side, pawn to knight 5, and the black knight retreated to king 2. Okay, white's move now. What's it to be? Well, no marks for pawn to king 5, because you let the black knights back into queen 4. You want to keep the black knights out of queen 4 for the moment. So, knight to bishop 3, at last. And now white stands better in this endgame, and the reason is that he has more space on the queen side, and the black knights on king 2 and bishop 3 are rather out of the game, because everything's happening on the queen side, and they're stuck over on the king side for the moment. But you have to play very accurately with white. Anyway, black's next move is fairly obvious, bishop to queen 2. And now he's coming to the queen's bishop file to molest your knight. So the time has come to form a plan. So have a nice long think about the position and form a plan. Well, the plan I formed ran as follows. White pawn to king 5. I know I told you you shouldn't play this last move, but it's different now. If you see the point of this move, if you don't see the point of this move, you should have a think about the position. Black must play knight on bishop 3 to queen 4. Now comes an exchange. Knight takes knight. Knight takes knight. Now white's next move is the vital part of his plan. What is it? the move is knight to queen 4. And the idea is as follows. Firstly, the knight on queen 4 dominates the black bishop on queen 2. Black's bishop has nowhere to go. Secondly, white is going to exchange his bishop for the knight, forcing black to recapture with the pawn, and then the knight on queen 4 will be on a blockading square, and white will get an endgame with knight against bad bishop. Okay, so black's next move is queen's rook to bishop 1. He cannot move the knight away from queen 4 because he would lose the queen's knight's pawn. And now white plays according to plan. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. And king's rook to bishop 1. Much better than the queen's rook. King's rook to bishop 1. And now put yourself in black's shoes. How should you defend this position with black? And think very carefully. It's a tricky position. Okay, make a note of this present position because we're going to do some analysis. The best move for black is pawn to queen's knight 3. And the idea is to play rook to bishop 4, and then double on the queen's bishop file, in which case white will either have to concede the file or swap rooks on bishop 4, in which case black can recapture with the pawn and repair his isolated pawn and in fact get two connected pass pawns in the centre. Now, if white meets pawn to queen's knight 3 with knight to bishop 6, then black can draw. He takes the knight, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. Now white threatens queen's rook to knight 1, winning the queen's knight's pawn. But black plays king's rook to king 1, an important tempo attacking the king pawn. If white defends the king pawn, pawn to bishop 4, then black plays rook to king 3 and he'll win the bishop's pawn. So white must play queen's rook to knight 1 instead. Black takes the king pawn, white takes the queen's knight's pawn. And this rook ending should be a draw. So against pawn to queen's knight 3, in the original position, white plays pawn to queen's rook 4. The idea being that against black's plan of rook to bishop 4, you play rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, knight to knight 3, winning a pawn. But the analysis doesn't end here. It's obvious because black has two connected pass pawns in the centre. The first line will go black pawn to bishop 5, forcing white to take the pawn. But if he does take the pawn with knight takes pawn, then black plays rook to rook 1, and when the knight moves away, there'll be a pin on the queen's rook file, so black will be able to capture the knight's pawn. Bishop takes knight's pawn. However, pawn to bishop 5 is bad because the white knight goes to queen 4, establishing a blockade. And now you have to calculate this blockade can't be broken. So, black rook to queen's bishop 1, white king to bishop 1, pawn to bishop 6, king to king 2, and the black king arrives in time. If rook to bishop 5, there comes king to queen 3, or if pawn to bishop 7, there comes king to queen 2. Okay, let's go back again to the position after black has played pawn to queen's knight 3. We're playing pawn to queen's rook 4 again for white. And black's playing rook to bishop 4 again. And white plays rook takes rook. And black plays pawn takes rook. And white plays knight to knight 3. What should black play here, if pawn to bishop 5 is bad? The answer is rook to queen's bishop 1, to try and maintain the 2 pawns on black squares in the centre. Now white can take the pawn, if he wants to, but then the 2 pawns in the centre become very dangerous. I calculated this position for a long time, and I estimated that it was unclear. White's best probably is to bring his king towards the centre and try and erect a blockade. It's much more important to blockade the 2 pawns, try and fix them on white squares, than to win a pawn. And if white can construct a blockade, he'll win the game, and if he can't, then he won't. But this is certainly how black should play, because this way black has counterplay. Maybe he will lose a pawn, maybe not, but he has counterplay. And the only way to defend a position with a bad bishop is to try and create counterplay. However, let's go back to the game now. So the move pawn to queen's knight 3 is not played. So put the pawn back on queen's knight 2. In the game, black played rook to bishop 5 to get rid of his isolated pawn, because white must now trade rooks. If he doesn't trade rooks, then black stands very well. Rook takes rook, pawn takes rook. And now, very important, what's the next move for white? Calculate the position carefully. The only move for white here is pawn to king's bishop 4. Why? The point is, white must bring his king into the centre, firstly to support the knight, and secondly to blockade the passed pawn. Now the quickest way to bring in the king is to play immediately king to bishop 1. But then black plays rook to queen's bishop 1, and on king to king 2, he plays rook to bishop 4, attacking 2 pawns. So, as a preliminary, white must defend the king pawn and allow the king to come in faster via bishop 2 and king 3. If you didn't choose the move pawn to bishop 4, then white's whole plan becomes nonsense. Okay, so pawn to king's bishop 4 by white. Black replied rook to queen's bishop 1. Now white must come with a king. King to bishop 2. At this point, it's important to calculate the following variation. If black advances, pawn to bishop 6, he must come with the king. King to king 3. And now he advances again, pawn to bishop 7. Now the correct way to stop the pawn is surprisingly not with the king, king to queen 2, because black will play rook to bishop 5, forcing white to play knight takes pawn, and then black will take the queen to knight's pawn, bishop takes pawn, and the position is not so clear. But instead of king to queen 2, the correct move is rook to queen's bishop 1. Now comes rook to bishop 6 check, king to king 4, and black takes the queen's rook's pawn, rook takes pawn. And now white takes off the queen's bishop pawn, rook takes pawn, with the terrible threat of rook to bishop 7, and white's centralized position is clearly winning. Okay, let's go back. We have the position where black has played rook to queen bishop 1, and white has just played king to bishop 2. Since he can't advance his bishop's pawn, black must do something, so he comes with the king into the center. King to bishop 1. Now white king to king 3, and black king to king 2. Now how do you play with white? The answer is you must blockade the queen's bishop pawn, the passed pawn, with the king. If you can establish a blockade of the pawn with the king, then white is winning. So you play simply king to queen 2. Now, were black to play pawn to bishop 6 check, white just plays king to queen 3 and comes and gobbles up the pawn with his rook. So black played first rook to bishop 4. Of course you defend the pawn with pawn to queen's rook 4. And now pawn to king's knight 3. At this stage I was very relieved, or very pleased, shall I say, to see black defending passively, because now I became absolutely confident that white has a winning position. King to bishop 3. This position can be assessed as being winning for white without calculation, because black has no counterplay and the knight dominates the bishop, and it's only a question of manoeuvring around, trying to create either a weakness or an entry or something. So black continued pawn to king's rook 4, restraining a white advance of his pawn majority in the center. Now comes the difficult part of the game. You have to win it. And to win it, you have to form a plan. So that's your job. Form a plan. How does white set about trying to win this position? And you have to be very careful and very accurate. Okay. Make a note of this position. The first attempt at a winning plan is to bring the rook to king 4 and then maneuver the knight to king 3, and you'll win the queen's bishop pawn. But there's a hazard, and it runs as follows. White rook to king 1, black bishop to knight 5, white rook to king 4, black bishop to queen 8. Whoops. Counterplay. So you don't do it like that. You have to be a little more subtle. The correct move is rook to queen 1. That is the move played, rook to queen 1. The idea is as follows. You first play rook to queen 2. In the meantime, black can undertake nothing active. And then you play knight to bishop 2, intending to set up rook on queen 4, knight on king 3. However, after knight to bishop 2, black will reply bishop to bishop 4, threatening to take the knight off, because the rook endgame is much more difficult to win. So you play knight to king 3, and then the bishop comes to queen 6, blocking the rook out of the game. But now you have the maneuver knight to queen 1. This is why you must move the rook from queen 1 to queen 2 before embarking on this maneuver. And your next move is knight to knight 2. This will force the bishop away, and then you play rook to queen 4, and you win a pawn. Okay, fine, but none of this happened. After the move rook to queen 1, black comes up with the move pawn to king's knight 4. Now what do you do against that? Now, you should be very pleased to see a move like that, because any opening of the position will help white, not black. So the correct response is rook to king 1. Now white is threatening simply to capture pawn takes pawn. So black is forced, to capture pawn takes pawn, and you recapture pawn takes pawn. Now you have an open file, and the win is becoming easier. Now black retreated, rook to bishop 1 to come to the open file. So what do you do now? And may I give you a hint? Be careful, the position is not quite as easy as it looks. Right, there are 3 possible plans. So before I show you the 3 plans, make a note of this position so that you can return to it. The first possibility is simply to take the open file, rook to king's knight 1. But then black blocks the file with bishop to knight 5. And if you try and remove the obstruction with rook to knight 3 and pawn to rook 3, then the unfortunate bishop to queen 8 is going to happen to you again. So that idea must be discarded. The simple rook to knight 1 does not work. The second and very tempting possibility is simply to advance in the centre, pawn to king's bishop 5. And I nearly played this. But then I noticed that after the reply rook to bishop 4, it's difficult for white to make progress without simplifying the position, because his rook is tied to defence of the king pawn, and his knight is tied to the defence of the king's bishop pawn. Now, okay, you may say you can advance with pawn to king 6 or pawn to bishop 6, but that destroys the mobility of your pawn centre. So if you play pawn to king 6, you're just left with a passed pawn, which will be blockaded by the black king. And if you play pawn to bishop 6 check, the king can come back to queen 1, and your rook will be eternally tied to the defence of the king pawn, and it can be difficult to make progress in this position. So go back to the position that you noted and look for a third possibility. The move played, and the most accurate move, is knight to bishop 2. The idea is that if black takes the open file with rook to king's knight 1, then comes knight to king 3. And the knight on king 3 is fantastic. It guards all the entry squares on the king's knight file, and simultaneously it wins the queen's bishop pawn. So that's that. As a result, after knight to bishop 2, black played bishop to bishop 4, threatening to take the knight when the rook endgame is not so easy for white. So knight to king 3, and now bishop to queen 6. But now the bishop has been lured into queen 6, so he no longer has a block on the king's knight file. So of course you take the open file. Rook to king's knight 1. Now it's easy. Black plays king to king 3. What's your next move? The move is, of course, rook to knight 5, attacking the king's rook's pawn, which black defends. Bishop to king 7. And your next trick. It is, of course, rook to bishop 5, so as to come in to bishop 6 with check and drive black backwards. The move played was rook to queen 1. Now, of course, rook to bishop 6 check, king back to king 2, and no prizes for knight to bishop 5 check, driving the black king back to bishop 1, because if it goes to king 1, then knight will come to queen 6 with check, winning everything. Now it's just a question of making the win as simple as possible. You have a choice here. You can, of course, play pawn to king 6, which wins a pawn with check and gives you 2 connected passed pawns. But you have to calculate something. You have to calculate the consequences of rook to queen 6 check. And of course, white can run away from the checks and he will be winning. But there is a much simpler win. Instead of pawn to king 6, I just played rook to queen 6. Because you should notice that after an exchange of rooks, the minor piece ending is completely hopeless for black. He loses all his pawns. So black must move away, rook to queen's bishop 1. And now the next move is not difficult. Rook to rook 6, threatening mate. The king can't go to king 1 because of a fork on queen 6, so it must go to knight 1. And now, if you want to be spectacular, you can play the move rook takes rook's pawn, winning a pawn, because after bishop takes rook, there's a knight fork on king 7. But that's unnecessarily flash, because black replies rook to queen 1, and his rook can come in on the queen file. Instead of rook takes pawn, the simplest move, which I played, is of course just to exchange the rooks. Knight to king 7 check, king to knight 2, knight takes rook, king takes rook, knight to queen 6. And this is hopeless for black. He has 3 pawns attacked, and he must lose many pawns in the endgame. In fact, he resigned in this position.